Hey, good morning, Saints. Over the weekend, I had a chance to listen to a little teaching from Dr. Michael Heiser, and um, he was talking about death and hell, and um, specifically about what happens to a soul is, you know, after the wicked die. Is it end in annihilation, meaning, you know, snuffed out of existence, or is there a continuation of the soul into eternity? And it's only 3 minutes long, so I want to, or 4 minutes long. I want to play to you this snippet that I heard, and then I was doing a Bible study this morning because it bothered me his answer. He basically leans toward annihilation, and that really bothered me. And although he didn't quote specific passages, he made a reference to a passage in Revelation, and he said one in Corinthians, which I didn't track down the Corinthians one because I was pretty sure I knew which one he was going for in the book of Revelation. And, I might be wrong or I might be right in terms of what he was trying to refer to, but um, let's listen to what he says, and then I want to show you some verses and then show you an interpretation I found this morning that I thought was really compelling. So this is about, what happens to a soul that's not saved into eternity.
What happens to a person who dies without Christ? What is your take on eternal punishment, annihilation, etc.? How does the resurrection of the unjust fit into this?
Well, I mean, if Adam and Eve, again, I do believe they had conditional immortality. In other words, if they wouldn't have sinned and they perpetually abide in the presence of God, essentially God's house, so to speak, Eden, they would have kept on living. Okay, so I would say it's conditional immortality. Everybody has, if we want to reverse the language, everybody's mortal. They're gonna die of something. So if they're kicked out of the garden, and really the rest of humanity sort of follows this template that we aren't born into the presence of God, we are, have to be brought back into relationship with God. That's just another way of saying salvation is needed. So that is, kind of the one thing that to me just seems the most obvious. If we're going back to the Edenic scene and then thinking about it theologically, what happens to a person who dies without Christ? Well, they have a Christless eternity. They spend eternity outside the presence of God, the family of God. They, to use other scriptural language, they're lost. That sort of thing. That naturally takes us into where the questioner took us. What's your take on eternal conscious punishment or annihilation, so on and so forth? I think for me, both of those things are actually still on the table. And I've said before on the podcast that it really depends on how you read certain language, especially in the Book of Revelation when it describes final judgment. So when I look at it, the thing that really puts annihilation on the table for me is the reference to the death of death, both in Revelation and also one place in 1 Corinthians. If death itself is truly destroyed, and that is what you actually read, in the book of Revelation, then I don't know how death could be eternally ongoing. It's either destroyed or it's not. And so annihilation seems to make a lot of sense in respect to that verse. And of course, if you have annihilation, that's permanent. So the judgment is permanent. The separation is permanent. Does it have to be conscious? Is really the question for some people, and some will take like Revelation 14:11, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. Well, if they were destroyed, again, the results of that are permanent too. And the smoke could just be a reference to the fact that they had been destroyed, they had been consumed, and annihilated in the flames. So the language of going up forever and ever just doesn't really help resolve the debate. That's part of why there is a debate. So I think for me, both of those things are on the table. If push came to shove, I think annihilation makes the best sense, but it's certainly not the only view that you could come out of that passage, and at least one other with. Again, it's hard for me to see how death itself could be destroyed and yet be ongoing in an eternal way. Those two things just don't seem to go together. But again, I'm not willing to to sort of push the more traditional view to the side. But I think annihilation really needs serious consideration. Like I said, for me, they're both on the table.
Okay. So you saw him, he's leaning toward annihilation, and he was saying the passage that bothered him was in Revelation toward the end, the final judgment. And so let's go take a look here. I did a search, and I'll tell you why I did the search that I did. It's because death is paired with hell. And we'll get to that in a second, but let's just take a look here. I think he was talking about Revelation 20, verse 13 and 14, toward the end of Revelation. 20 includes white throne judgments, the final judgment, right? So I think this is the passage he made reference to, and this is what bothered him, is death being cast into the lake of fire, the second death, the eternal, right? So how he was saying, how can death be annihilated? And then, souls continue to live on forever. So let's just read the verse. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. And they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And so there you go, how if death and hell were destroyed in the lake of fire, how does a soul continue on forever? How does judgment proceed forever for the souls that went into Sheol or death and hell? And this is the part now, because when I taught through Revelation last year, I had really studied this verse in Revelation 6:8, and I looked, behold, a pale horse, and his name sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword, hunger, with death, and the beasts of the earth. And when I was teaching that, you also look at Isaiah 28, and I give thanks to Bill Salas for pointing those verses out again, where a covenant is made with Israel, and they make the covenant with death and hell. And that's, probably the covenant that you see in Daniel 9. That's the parallel everybody draws. So I wanted to bring you over. I was doing a little research on this morning, because death and hell, again, going back to when I really dug into it, they are treated together as entities. And I guess you could say, well, that's just a personification, right? Going back to my old high school English, is that just a personification of death? And so, obviously hell is a place, and death and hell is just the definition, what happens after you die if you're not in Christ. But if you look, death and hell, when they're paired together, it's always in the personification. And so that's what was bugging me last year. And then I hear Dr. Michael Heiser quote those verses saying, see, that supports annihilation. And it was really bugging me. And so I was looking up here. Now, this apostles-creed.org, I read the guy's about page. It's just an individual who apparently has a real long history of study. And he went through a bunch of different denominations. He went through the Baptist denomination. He went through Calvary Chapel stuff, Reformed. He kind of did it all. He was at Grace Church, I think Dr. John MacArthur, for a while. He studied. But I didn't get the impression that he was, credentialed in some way, but he makes one heck of an argument here. And so with those caveats, I still want to read you his argument because I thought, dang, that's it. But we'll see what you think. What the Greeks understood about, and I'm right here, death and hell, or Hades, differs widely from what modern Christians teach about death and Hades. The Bible Concordance says, Hades being a place of the departed spirits. And then there's references where it's used as a location, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you'll descend to Hades, right? And in Hades, lift up his eyes, being in torment. And this is, this story of being in Abraham's bosom for Lazarus, right? So Hades can be the place, no doubt, in some of its usage. But there's also this, to understand what the average Greek meant by people of Greece during the apostles' time, we need to understand the Greek culture at the time words were written. It is common for Bible interpreters to force modern ideas into the text. The first century Greeks believed Hades was a god. Hades was a brother of Zeus and Poseidon. After the overthrow of their father Cronus, he drew lots with them to share the universe. He drew poorly, which resulted in becoming lord of the underworld and ruler of the dead. And so the underworld being the place, Hades being, the ruler of the underworld. Where the souls were locked up with gates and keys. In Greek mythology, Hades had keys which locked up the souls behind the gates. The gates of Hades were secured, locked to prevent escape the souls. Hades or his doorman, Aeacus, kept the golden keys. Well, here all of a sudden you see in Matthew, and I also said to you, Peter, upon this rock which I built my church, rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overpower it. And then Revelation is the reference, I have the keys to death and Hades. Well, there you go. So you see the influence of the Greek understanding of hell, that there's a demonic spirit that rules over it, that there's gates that are locked up. And I even think that passage in Revelation, an angel or a star falls to earth and he's got the keys to Hades, and he opens it up. Was that Revelation 8 maybe? Don't quote me on it. But it's the same notion. The gates are opened up with keys, and it's the gates of the underworld, right? And what comes out? The demon locust, I think, if that's the reference, somewhere in there. And then the definition of death in the Greek, we think of it as the spiritual death, the place it goes. And that's true. It can be, the location for either, the death of the soul or spiritual, I guess. It could be for the wages of sin is death, free gift of God is eternal life. The demonic representation of death in ancient Greek mythology, demonic here is used with a classical meaning which refers to benevolent or benign nature spirits. He did not play a major part in Greek mythology and rarely appeared in any stories, as he was mostly displaced by Hades, the god of the underworld. The first century Greek would also understand death, or Thanatos, was a spirit being along with Hades, the god of the underworld. With this information we can translate the meaning of death in Hades. And here he's going through the passages where death in Hades is used in this Greek classical thinking. And this is Revelation 1, when I saw him, I fell as a dead man. He laid his hand upon me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I live forevermore. I have the keys to death and of Hades. So even Christ himself, I think, was, put this way, he was affirming the Greek understanding of how hell worked. And then in John, he's saying that Jesus Christ had fired Hades, the god of the underworld, took Hades' keys, and now Jesus Christ himself is the keeper. John tells us that death, Thanos, and Hades are traveling together, having the authority given to them to kill 1/4 of the earth, and that's in Revelation 6. And that's the one I was studying last year that really led me to believe they were entities and not just personifications of places. And I look and behold an ashen horse. He who sits on it had the name of death. That's a strong personification to say he has the name. And Hades was following him, and the authority was given over the 4th part of the earth to kill with a sword, famine, pestilence, and the wild beasts of the earth. Clearly, death and Hades in this passage refers to spirits or angels. John said, he who sat on it had the name death, meaning death was a person, not a place or a thing. And so he goes down and then he says, makes the same comparison we just did, where he reads that Revelation 20 verse. First statement, death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, would not make sense as places. The word them is, person, he, she, that type of thing. Personal pronouns are not used for places, but for a person or a thing. Here the word there would be used instead. He's saying here's how, there would be used in Acts. In Revelation 20:14, the word there would have been used and not them. If death and Hades were places, the second passage makes sense if we understand the lake of fire was made for. Well, Matthew here says in 25 that then he would also say to those on his left, depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew clearly states that the lake of fire was created for the devil and his angels. The lake of fire isn't for ideas or places, but for specific people. More specifically, the lake of fire is for the devil and his angels and followers. And so there I think you get the understanding which really fits us all together. The whole book of Revelation, when it speaks of this, is using what the Greek mind would understand about the place of Hades, about the spirit of Hades, about the spirit of death, about the keys that lock, the underworld. That seems consistent all the way through. And so, what was bugging me about Dr. Michael Heiser is he probably took it as a personification when death and Hades were used. Therefore, he was thinking it's just a personification of the place. And if the place gets totally annihilated in the final destruction in Revelation 20, then, the souls that were in it would experience annihilation and not ongoing torment. He made that argument sort of where the smoke of their torment rise up forever, not necessarily doing it for them. But I think here, if you really take the Greek understanding, which is supported all the way through the chapter, that's death and Hades, the entities, the fallen demonic entities being thrown into the lake of fire. And so, and then you also get the passage, and the souls that were with them were thrown in the lake of fire. So there is the ongoing torment, and it's eternal. It just happens to be with the two entities named death and Hades. So I wonder if that is surprising for anybody or not. I just felt, a little vindication on that one, to be honest. I was shocked when I heard Dr. Michael Heiser talk about that annihilationism. But, I love the guy, right, because he brings so many things forward in terms of the angelic realm and the divine council and the whole nines. And so, that just the annihilation of souls will bug me. If we can have a reward through Christ of eternal life, then the counter has to be true, that without Christ it's eternal punishment. That is the only thing that makes sense in my mind, with passages that support it, like the one he referred to. The smoke of their torment rises up forever. And I think that's really, in my opinion, and I'm no Dr. Whiz-Bang, but I really liked what this Apostles' Creed, what this gentleman put together here. I think that just nails it, makes sense of the whole theme in the book of Revelation and the interpretation of the way the Greek is used. So I'll leave you there, saints. God bless. I hope this was a little blessing for you.